Bringing you the rigs, the trucks, the laboratories, and offices, this is the Oil and Gas Contractors Connect podcast with your host, Ryan Ray.
Welcome to another edition of the Oil and Gas Contractors Connect podcast. Ryan Ray, your host as always. So glad to have you. And again, I am the owner of R Square Global, and this is the show where we get to connect with other contractors throughout the industry. Be sure to connect with me on LinkedIn, which will be linked to in the show notes, or you can find out more about R Square Global by going to GOR2.com. That's GOR, the number 2.com. We will link to that in the show notes. Today we have on another Ryan Van Esler, who is the managing member of Rhino Consulting LLC, working as an independent landman for the last 17 years in 11 different states. Ryan, thank you for coming on today. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so
two Ryans don't make a right.
Yeah, exactly. One Ryan definitely doesn't make a right. So, let's talk about Landman. You know, I just had on a guest. I was recording an episode earlier today with a right-of-way agent, and we were kind of distinguishing the difference between a landman and a right-of-way agent, but he's more of a right-of-way guy. So from a landman's perspective, why don't we start there? Let's distinguish, what is a landman, what do landmen do, and maybe how they're different from what we call a right-of-way agent.
A landman in the petroleum realm is somebody that looks at the minerals first. So we're looking at anything subsurface that has to do with the mineral estate. Over the years, that could be severed into many different portions of the mineral estate. And so we're responsible for looking at the records that are available in the county level, as well as private records that we can acquire. Sometimes we also look at federal lands through the BLM, state lands, obviously through their offices. And it's really a vast array of skill sets that goes into looking at what has transpired since the land was given in a patent from the government all the way until the present day mineral ownership. After we establish who owns the minerals in the present time, we look at who owns the leases in the present day, what is producing at present, who owns various other interests in the mineral estate that is connected to that leasehold, being non-participating royalty interests, overriding royalty interests, the working interest, and what the net revenue is for each unit within a section.
So let me ask you this. I'm from Louisiana, originally live in Texas now. In Louisiana, I'm not a landman, but as I understand the law is, if you were to sell your property and you had your mineral rights and you pass them on to, you retain them. Okay, you retain them, and the person buying your property, did not get them. You can only hold those for 10 years unless they were under production. And I'm curious, you said you've worked in 11 different states. Is Louisiana unique like that, or are there other states where they have kind of this time capsule where if you don't put the minerals under production, they go to the current landowner, or is it pretty much, like, hey, once you buy them, you can hold them forever in most other states that you've worked in?
Louisiana is the only state that has that revisionary rule. There are some laws that are similar to that, but not in the same way. So typically, if the minerals have been severed from the surface, those are to stay just like if it was a surface estate, and they can be bought and sold in the same way. A lot of times in these really heavy production areas, like in Oklahoma, you may have reservations very far back in the 30s and 40s where people have reserved minerals. That is a whole separate mineral estate from that point forward that can be deeded out, can be inherited. So investment oriented.
Right. Yeah, I've never heard of another state, but I'm not a landman, so I'm not really sure what all the provisions are. It does not surprise me that Louisiana has that unique law. They have Several unique laws, as a former citizen can attest to. Let's talk about this process, because if you're talking about, non-Louisiana residents, so Texas, Oklahoma, maybe up in the Northeast or wherever, you can see where you can run into situations where back in 1962, great grandpa Joe sold the minerals to Bob, and now Bob's trust, family estate, or whatever has them or sold on to him, and now I own the surface, and they've been severed, as you mentioned. Kind of walk us through the process of, how do you tackle a problem like that? What are some of the pitfalls that you might see when E&P companies are out there trying to acquire these minerals and get the rights to drill? Just kind of walk us through that general process that you're seeing from a landowner standpoint, and maybe some things from the E&P side that they have to tackle as well.
Well, when there's a severance of record, a landman is going to basically track that estate to its entirety. So a lot of times a mineral deed is used, someone inherits it through a will. Those are where the issues arise, because sometimes the documentation does not reflect exactly what's owned. Sometimes there is no will that was probated in the records. As a landman, we're looking at how does the mineral estate transfer. And so there's laws of intestate succession that come into play, where we have to get into some genealogy on, who the children were, who the grandchildren, etc., to figure out what interests are owned from that mineral reservation. In your example, in 1962, who owns that in present day. So an E&P company can see that we're basically using us as insurance to say, my landman that I hired is going to figure out who owns this. There are times when a court case needs to come up, or a document needs to be filed in the county records that state who the heirs were, and a stipulation of interest with a cross conveyance to each party to clear any clouds that you have on title. And that's what we call a curative action.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with surface stuff, you normally go back 30 years is kind of the rule of thumb. How much more difficult is it to clear this title that you're dealing with genealogies and stuff like that, compared to maybe resolving a mortgage issue or a lien issue when you're dealing with surface stuff?
There can be a very large amount of problems. Any of the landmen that are listening to this now are probably laughing about that, because so many problems can arise. It can be extremely difficult. I do recall one time having a gentleman that reserved a 30-second interest in some minerals, 1930, and the only information I had to go off of was his name was J.T. Ford. And so I had to track down when Mr. Ford died, who his children were, when they passed away, who his grandchildren were, where they lived. And then I had to, file the documents showing that this was the original J.T. Ford's reservation interests in present day. And we executed a lease for those minerals at that time. As far as in comparison, typically, if you have a surface issue, it could be cleared up fairly easy, because the parties involved are very current. And so everybody can have a meeting and say, here's the mortgager, here's the mortgagee, here's what the issue is, and file a correction, and everything's done. And a mineral estate, if you've got something that's 70, 80 years old, you're having to do quite a bit more legwork. There's a lot more involved.
Right. Oh, okay. So let me ask you this, kind of shift focus there a little bit. We talked about the title, that story. How long did it take you, just real quick, to kind of resolve that JT Ford, that JT Ford situation?
I spent a solid week on that, trying to find who that was and what happened. I traced them from Arkansas to Louisiana to Missouri and back to Arkansas.
Wow. Well, okay. So let me ask you this. One of the things that you hear when you talk about dealing with drilling activity and the need to get the product obviously out of the ground, and then out of the ground you got to start getting it to market. And so there's obviously you can truck it, you can build pipelines. One of the things I'd like for you to clear up maybe for some of the listeners is this term lease rights, laying under lease rights. Kind of walk us through generally what that term means, when it applies, and what are the best cases for a company to use lease rights.
Typically, leases are paid up leases, which means that a company has given you a bonus per acre to lease your rights. There's a lot of stipulations on those leases. That's one thing that is very specific to the company that is leasing. They may have a lot of different clauses that they want to put into those leases. Each one of those is particular to their business model as to production in that section. So lease rights can be a huge variable as far as minerals go. But typically those lease rights are granting them the rights to explore minerals in that section. Typically has some sort of degree of depth. So if there is no degree of depth, the lease is from the surface of the earth to the center of the earth. And sometimes leases are for specific formations or specific depths.
So when you look at that, you say, okay, we got to go through this process of pulling all this title, acquiring these, kind of grouping these together. Kind of walk us through just the average life cycle of a project for a landman. We're talking, obviously, if you have a very robust company who's like a Pioneer or an Apache maybe who's constantly drilling, you can see that could go on for years and years on end. But when you start this process, where do you come in the value chain? And then maybe how far ahead of drilling are you guys? And then what do you see yourself, and does the job maybe evolve from, early on it's a lot of title pulling and then it's the contract negotiation, or is it kind of the same set of utilities that you're deploying throughout the life of a project?
It depends on the area that we're going to be working in. I've worked on projects that basically we had a budget set. We deployed leasing agents and title agents, which are both part of land management. It may take us a few months actually negotiate all the leases, and at the same time we're starting on the title to figure out who owns the mineral rights. So it's a work in progress from the very get-go. Some projects I've worked on have lasted several years. Geology plays a big role in the expansion of an area of mutual interest or an area of interest for an individual company. We look at where we can explore within those sections. That's something that the E&P company has to keep in mind as far as the value chain goes, because each acre that is leased has our research time has to be calculated into the value of that lease. If it took us a week to run the title, if it took us 6 weeks to run the title, those are two very different budget points that go into a cost per acre analysis for that project.
So let me ask you this. Every time no matter what profession you're in, there's always pitfalls that you're aware of as a professional that you want to advise your client on. You say, going into this project, these are the things that they seem maybe minute, or they seem that we can overlook them, but if we don't catch them, sometimes it's a permit, sometimes it's something that you think, this isn't a big deal, but if you don't get it, nip it in the bud, if you will, it can become a very big problem later on. What are some of the things as a landman that you see and you advise clients on, saying, we want to go ahead and get out in front of this or these issues before they become a problem later on?
I think a big issue is in Oklahoma, we have a lot of older production. One of the big pitfalls is not looking at held by production outside the section that you're working in that may be connected to your section. I've seen where companies have bought leases and they are held by production from an outside section. That is very costly.
Yeah, exactly.
But, at the same time, I advise my clients to look at whether they're going to factor that into their risk or not. Some companies are willing to take a risk and cancel the lease later on. Some companies want us to research every single facet pitfall that there is so that, they're protected before they even lease anybody or conduct a pooling order or anything like that.
Okay, so let's shift gears away from the business side of things, and let's just talk to listeners who might be in a different part of the industry, and you go, you know what, this Landman stuff, it does sound kind of interesting to me. What would be some things that you would maybe, some tips, tricks, inside baseball, if you will, for someone who says, you know what, I want to be a Landman. What do they need to know? Just what would be a good launching point for them?
There are some really great educational programs out there. I mean, OU has a great petroleum land management course, a few different landman private schools that are based here in Oklahoma City that basically teach you the basics of what you're going to be dealing with as a landman. I would advise anybody that thinks that they want to be a landman that there's a lot of analyzing that happens. There's a big amount of data. There are a lot of laws that come into play when you're looking at anything dealing with surface or mineral estates. A background in law or a paralegal or, something to that effect that is a little bit familiar with what a will record is and how that's put together, the different laws in the different states that affect, minerals are vast. And I would also say that this is an upstream part of the oil and gas industry. So it is cyclical based upon the prices of oil as a commodity. You really need an understanding of the geopolitical side of oil and gas worldwide, that's going on.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, I'm going to wrap it up here after this final question for you. I've said in the past that, and I've got plenty of friends who are right-of-way agents, so I'm not being disparaging about right-of-way agents, but it seems that if you're a really good landman, and as you mentioned, you have these life cycles, so, if drilling slows down today, the pipelines will still be built for maybe the next 6 months, a year, 2 years, depending on what's going on. And if you're a good landman and you understand title, okay, so you can do title as a right-of-way agent, and you've negotiated contracts, so you can negotiate a right-of-way agent, you can really transition maybe and pick up some work in a lean time for drilling as a right-of-way agent. But as a right-of-way agent, sometimes it's not as easy for them to transition to a landman just because of some of the technical aspects of the title and things like that. They some have been exposed to, but not all. Would you agree with that assessment, or am I off there?
No, that's absolutely correct, because it's a lot easier as a landman to look at surface, because we've already looked at surface to get to the mineral estate. So we already understand, everything that goes on with the surface laws, the right-of-way, easements, everything that happens on the surface, because we have to examine those documents as well to get to the mineral estate and what's going on, because, typically our clients want to know, what is encumbrances on the surface, what's, an encumbrance on the mineral estate. And so, we include those in our reports if required. But coming from a surface standpoint, if you've been doing right-of-way and the extent of your knowledge is running a 30-year surface search, all of a sudden you have to run 100+ years of surface and minerals. It's a much different career path.
Exactly. Okay. Now, we said at the start of the show that you are the managing member of Rhino Consulting, working as an independent landman. So if people want to connect with you at Rhino Consulting, they want to find out more about what you guys have going on, why don't you direct them? And if you got anything else you want to plug or promote, feel free to do that at this time.
Sure, you can always contact me on LinkedIn, Ryan Van Esler. We are full service in land work, so if you need any due diligence projects, we do full mineral surface reports. We do held by production. I'm currently working on a section in Carter County that has 28 active wells, some of them still producing from 1949, and a lot of different depths. We're familiar with, what's hot right now, what formations and pay zones are really hot to the clients. So,
yeah, and just for the listener's point of view, you guys are based out of where, and where all are you? You said 11 states, so where are you focusing your work at least right now?
We're based in Edmond, Oklahoma, and we're focusing right now on Oklahoma, but we've worked in Arkansas, Michigan, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Kansas, Texas.
Yeah.
So
I think everyone's worked in Texas at least once. Exactly.
Yeah, anything you need, we could definitely help out with.
Okay, great. Well, Ryan, this has been really informative. Thank you for your time. And to the listeners, until next time, keep climbing.